This is augforums.com Real Talk, an unfiltered, independent perspective on Acumatica Cloud ERP. My name is Tim Rodman, and I want to mention 3 things in this pre-recorded intro before we get started. First, thank you to our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Paya. Paya offers Acumatica users a suite of industry-leading payment orchestration tools. Far beyond native Acumatica payments, Paya enables EMV, NFC terminals for counter sale. They offer a frictionless customer portal through their click-to-pay solution, and they support most e-commerce platforms and point-of-sale solutions used with Acumatica, such as One Retail and AcuPOS. And best of all, omni-channel reconciliation is available for all of their solutions. Our second sponsor is DataSelf. DataSelf Analytics is a revolutionary reporting solution that enables organizations to make the most informed decisions faster and easier than ever. It uniquely simplifies business intelligence, empowers anyone to build and access dashboards, and delivers critical business insight when and where you need it. Our third sponsor is 24/7 Digitize. 24/7 Digitize is an Acumatica bookkeeping service provider that helps derive the best value from your Acumatica investment by maintaining your books utilizing Acumatica's best practices and guidelines. Please take a minute to support this podcast by clicking each one of the sponsor banners located at augforums.com/sponsors. Our sponsors track clicks, and every click helps to support this podcast. The second thing I'd like to mention is that I'm always looking for victims. I mean guests. If you use Acumatica in any capacity, no matter how small, I'd love to talk with you. Check out augforums.com/podcast and click the link near the top of the page to learn more about being a guest on the podcast. Third and finally, I'd love to see you listed on my Rolodex. Check out augforums.com/Rolodex to find out who else is using Acumatica and read the instructions at the top to see how you can add yourself to the list. All right, that's it for the pre-recorded intro. Let's get started. Today is Friday, December 16th, 2022, and this is episode number 105, Tom Fahres, Loss, Grieving, and Acumatica ERP Implementations. Hey, Tom, thanks for coming back on as a second time on the podcast.
Always a pleasure, Tim. Yes, this deeply personal topic is just as motivating as some of our technical ones, so I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks you for being willing to entertain this kind of unusual episode. And I thought I'd start off by kind of sharing where the idea came from. So I just started doing therapy about 3 months ago. I realize now I should have done it years ago. It's not that I ever felt like it was beneath me. I just didn't prioritize it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand how sitting there and talking would make any difference in the world. So I just didn't prioritize it, didn't put it on my calendar, didn't want to spend the money. But as of a few months ago, I have been, and it's been quite amazing. In some ways good amazing, in some ways bad amazing, but overall I think good. And as I've been doing this, it caused me to recall our last episode, which I will put on the episode page here at augforums.com/episode 105, where we touched on this kind of towards the end a little bit. And I think I even made the comment that when I was reading a book on grief a couple years ago, it made me think this sounds like an ERP implementation. So that's kind of the motivation for doing this, devoting an entire episode to it. It's very relevant to my experience currently. And then I think you also have something to share as well. So that's why we're doing this. And thanks for being a willing participant.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thanks for the intro and kind of the motivation. We'll dig into more in the links between this topic and that prior topic. That'll actually come near the end. So, from our outline that Tim and I kind of agreed on was we will first dive into rather personal stories of grief. Um, some of the specific feelings, how those impact us, how do we react to those feelings. We'll talk a little bit about like some of the technical and professional shortcomings of trying to package grief into a plot. We will talk about some lessons learned that each of us in our own personal grief journeys have come away with. And then we'll end the session with relating some of those personal stories to ERP implementation per Tim's kind of original tie between sessions. Anything else to add?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, you're primary amateur therapist here. And we'll probably swap that role from time to time. But yeah, we're kind of playing therapist and patient back and forth here.
Okay. Yep. And right, we will kind of swap and blur those lines a little bit, but I'll start and say, so Tim, what would you like to talk about today? What's your kind of personal motivation? You mentioned the technical at the beginning, but what's kind of your personal motivation for today's topic?
Yeah, I think I'll respond with, well, why did I go into therapy 3 months ago? um, it started off as I was calling it grief therapy originally, although I've kind of learned since it's not really a specific type of therapy. It sort of depends on the day. Sometimes it's grief therapy, like sometimes it's marriage therapy, sometimes it's some other kind of therapy. It's just sort of whatever comes up. It's just this big jumble of stuff. And so the reason for doing that, I'll go all the way back actually to April of 2013. Don't worry, I'll speed up. um, Something happened that I won't go into the details on, but something happened in my family that was pretty, I would even use the word traumatic for me personally. Um, it didn't involve me directly, but for me, it was still a traumatic experience. And I like how we've got in our outline some bullet points about specific feelings. We're typical guys here. We put bullet points to our feelings, and one of the ones we have there is shame. And I think April 2013, that was the primary feeling for me, shame.
Wow.
And also we have on here anger, and shame turned into anger pretty quickly for me. And I've actually been reading a book called Anger Management Workbook for Men just in the past month. And it's sort of like a very foundational type of thing. But for me, it's like revolutionary stuff. Maybe for most people, it's like elementary stuff. For me, it's revolutionary stuff. And one of the things I've learned is that anger is not a primary feeling, it's a secondary feeling.
Ooh, okay. Good.
So there's something behind it. And so if you pause and think about, why is it? Am I hurt? Is it shame? Is it sadness? Is it frustration? There's something underlying it. And so, anyways, April 2013 for me was traumatic. And it's interesting that that is the same month that I started blogging at what's now AUGforums.com. So if you go
Oh
there and you
wow.
look at that /blog, you scroll all the way to the bottom, April 2013. And yeah, we all have coping mechanisms, especially us guys, for handling our feelings. And that was looking back, that was one of my coping mechanisms.
Wow, going back to the root, that is fascinating. I had no idea. Didn't know that was coming. Wow, that's like a whole episode right there. Coming up with a coping mechanism. So, can you elaborate on what does grief have to do? Sorry, what does shame have to do with grief? That's really kind of interesting. I mean, I know we may each have our own context, but for you, what is? Can you elaborate on shame? Why shame? I mean, sad. The average person knows grief in some form. So anger, sadness, um, but shame. What does shame have to do with grief for you?
Actually, I hadn't thought about if there's a tie in there. This is a separate situation. I'll fast forward to the main situation. This was kind of like I'm layering in three main things that happened. This one I won't go into, but that was the shame. And I'll hit one other point on that. When the shame turned into anger, which I recognize now but didn't then, that's also around the time when I started. What's the word for it? I can't remember now the social media term for this, but when you kind of like throw rocks at something, there's a social media term for it. I'm blanking on it, but that's what I I started like poking at Sage. Like one summit, I wore a shirt that said "Sage sucks," and I wrote this whole blog post actually, maybe 2014, can't remember, about Sage. And it's only in the past month since reading this book that it dawned on me I was taking my anger out on Sage. Another kind of like had a lot of these little, yeah, realizations.
That's fascinating. Okay, for a self-professed introvert, you, um, you routinely throw yourself out there, writing songs about software products, hosting a podcast, and then being bold enough to like do some kind of public, I guess, kind of shaming event by wearing a T-shirt at a forum. I don't know if introvert's totally the right label for you, but that's I hadn't heard that, and what a fascinating tie to like not just being say frustrated as a reseller with a publisher that happens to all of us, but to recognize that maybe some of your motivation was not actually professional, some of it was maybe based on some personal items. Okay,
Yeah, and didn't realize it at the time at all.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Whoa. Okay. Wow. So that's yeah.
So that's like setup. So then I'll hit the grief, the main grief part. So in 2015, in the spring, is when we first started talking as a family about my dad's memory loss. It became real like in spring 2015. And my wife and I and our two kids had just moved to Columbus, Ohio in the fall of 2014. So, new place, 2,000 miles away from San Diego, where my parents were. And then this thing hits. And where it really hits then is later in the fall of 2015. So, I scrolled up my timeline that I wrote a while back to try to piece it all together. So I actually started working at Acumatica in September of 2015. And then the next month, October, is when my dad's employer sent a letter basically putting him on leave and requiring him to get cleared by a doctor because it was affecting his work enough. And they had documented enough where they could do a letter. And then November, the next month, this is all starting to really hit. And I go to San Diego for Thanksgiving. Um, it was going so fast at the time, it's like this could be the last Thanksgiving. So I go to Thanksgiving, spend time with my dad. Then 2 days after getting back to Ohio in December, my dad has a stroke. And with his form of dementia, it's not Alzheimer's. It's the dementia that caused the stroke, not the other way around. And so then 6 days, so 4 days later, 6 days after getting back to Ohio, I'm back on a plane, back to San Diego to see my dad in the hospital. And then I get back to Ohio. And then less than a month later, my grandmother goes into the hospital, who had been living with my parents for about 2 years because of Alzheimer's. And she goes in the hospital and passes away in January. So then I'm out on another flight. Actually, it was January 7th that I arrived. So, yeah, definitely less than a month. I was there for 10 days. I happened to get there like the night before she passed away, got to sleep next to her bed and hold her hand all night. And she passed away like in the early morning hours, which was an amazing experience. Um, and then, we're at the hospital. My dad's kind of wandering around the halls, so you've got this like these multiple things that are going on. Um, and then on that trip, it was a 10-day trip. Somewhere in there, we convinced my dad to go do his retirement paperwork because he worked for the county of San Diego. And then we had like a little retirement party for him and my grandmother's funeral. So there was a lot going on in that trip. And then over from 2015 to 2020, those 5 years, I was back and forth. I averaged about 75 days a year in California, and then had work travel on top of that. So it was this kind of disembodied experience. I was in Ohio most of the time, but mentally in San Diego. Actually, for a whole year, I couldn't fall asleep without kind of imagining myself in San Diego. Eventually, I got falling asleep under control, and then I couldn't stay asleep. That was even worse because I had no control over it. And so just kind of this just jumble of stuff. And then by 2019, I think that's when I first started actively grieving because there was a lot going on, like, you know, just trying to take care of different things. And I was in doer mode.
Yeah, you were just staying one step ahead, right? So busy, just the blur of the family in Columbus, work, the physical travel back and forth for both the family visits and for work. Gosh, so interesting, like little aside that like during this point in time, I would have encountered you here in Denver, Colorado, like for some like a professional event. I remember like you came out to one of Doug Hollenbach as our host for an Acumatica user group in the Rocky Mountains. And you were in the midst of all this, going back and forth and not sleeping well, not really quite grieving, or maybe just starting to figure it out. Wow. Okay. That's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, so I would say the sadness part, we've got that as a bullet point on our list of feelings, didn't really
Mm-hmm.
hit until 2019. Um, and that was actually when I sold my truck, which I had had for about 20 years. And cleaning out the truck, like in Ohio, there's nothing that reminds me of my dad, but the truck did. And cleaning it out to go take it to CarMax to sell it was very difficult.
What prompted the sell of this vehicle? Like it's just you're just kind of done physically with using that particular vehicle.
Yeah, I was going up to a client once a week and needed a reliable car, and it kept having problems and then just stopped starting. If I lived out in the country, I would have put it in the backyard as a play structure because my kids loved climbing on it. I almost did it anyways, and just ready to fight the neighbors, but I didn't. So yeah, I sold it. Sold it to
Yeah, I
CarMax.
asked because I was kind of trying not for like the physical needs of the vehicle, but like what maybe either delayed or triggered selling it, right? In kind of asking as from a therapist perspective.
Oh, it didn't. Because I was going up once a week to a client. I needed a vehicle. So as soon as it stopped working, I sold it. There was no, yeah, and it was just kind of a black and white decision making.
Right. And then the emotional wave hit as you were actually executing on this plan. Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Okay. So that brings up, we don't have a bullet point for this, Tim, but the unexpected nature of grief, when it shows up, how it shows up, why did it show up? That will be something we are going to dig into during the balance of the hour for sure. But we didn't have a bullet point for it. Yeah.
But you're
Okay.
right. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that word, really. I didn't know that's what I was really experiencing. Yeah. Now, you had your own story too. Do you want to hit that now, or what do you think?
I think that's totally appropriate. Yeah. Because in addition to a little bit of kind of project management associated with, say, an ERP implementation life cycle, the ups and downs, the emotional journey that participants, shareholders, stakeholders go through. I agreed to this session with Tim because of it's a fairly personal topic. So for me, I'm going back quite a ways, and some folks who might listen to this who I've worked with professionally, they know that uh, they might know, happily married, had our 25th wedding anniversary trip this year. The kids are now 20 and 17. And, a lot of folks would know me as a parent of two boys. But my family and very close friends, and now a little bit larger audience potentially, and my wife and I talk about this all the time. When do we share this? That I'm actually a parent of three children, in that my wife and I lost our first child at birth. My wife had sort of a high risk pregnancy that was highly monitored, but going well. And we had named the little girl because we found out about her, that she was a girl. That was kind of our election, at whatever that is, about 6 months or so into the pregnancy. We lost her at about 41 and a half weeks. So a little bit past like normal term, but that was under like a doctor's close supervision. And, it just kind of points out that it really came down to just kind of birth is risky. Pregnancy is risky. Just mechanically what actually happened to Ava, that's her name. We named her Ava Pearl. And this was 21, 22 years ago now. She ended up, I think, resting on her umbilical cord in some way that basically cut off nutrients and or oxygen. So that just happens sometimes in utero. It's a risky proposition biologically. For us personally, I agreed to this topic today because the unpredictable nature of grief, how long it can last. When Tim and I were talking about this topic, he's like, wow, 21, 22 years, Tom. I'm like, oh yeah. And I still have elements of processing that grieving process today. And I expect to have them really for the rest of my life. Right. So we're gonna pick on psychologists a little bit later today for trying to package this up into like a plot that has a start and an end, much like a project manager risks doing, saying like, well, once we reach the end of this project, everything will be just rainbows. So we're gonna pick on our profession a little bit too. But my story, I was excited to kind of like share some details and some lessons learned from a very personal story, and some of the things that I come away with, and it has continued to serve me. Love never diminishes. Your heart actually just kind of keeps finding room to grow. You think about like if you have been a pet owner in your life and you had this precious animal and you had to watch their life come to an end. I'll never know a dog or a cat or a goat or a rabbit or fish like that again. And then along comes another sweet animal into your life, and you're like, oh my gosh, they're their own unique thing. The heart just kind of keeps finding room. It's kind of amazing that it doesn't diminish the memories you had from the other animal. So grieving, and grieving Ava Pearl dying, and not becoming a parent until again until a few years later when our first son came home, is was just kind of a good lesson, because I felt like this curtain over so much of life for quite some time, and then you break through, but you don't just shed all of it. There's a part of it that lives with you. The love, the grief, they find a place in your heart alongside the new um, children to raise and love and cherish, and for us, the next pair of Labradors, right alongside pictures of animals who'd passed away years ago. So, anyways, that's it. A little bit like the heart just kind of keeps growing in surprising ways, even when you can't picture it. Just like Tim, you and I have had a similar. I couldn't really envision at a time the role that therapy might play. How would that help me? I don't get how that would help me. I'm not going to focus on it. And then years later, I was surprised, and remain, continue to be surprised when I do participate in therapy even today, the value it delivers.
And you made a comment there about a curtain, that that resonated with me. That the analogy I was using was glass. Like when you go visit someone in jail and you have to pick up the phone and talk through the glass. It's like the outside world, there's a layer of glass. That's how it felt for me between, I was still participating, could still see through it, but there was just something there. And especially 2019, 2020, a very heavy depression, hard to get up in the morning, uh, eating too much, not able to stay asleep. There's a whole list of, of bullet
Of
points. And
like not so healthy coping mechanisms that.
yeah, and I think on the sadness point, like one thing that I didn't realize until again last 3 months, is that like being able to shed tears is one something that's hard to do on your own, and two, I like resisted it because I thought it would make me more sad.
Oh, right, right. The physical manifestation of the feelings you have would, like, you were worried it was going to cause like a feedback loop. Like, oh, well, I'll just be sadder if I cry. Wow.
Great job, by the way, of taking feelings and turning them into a feedback loop, something, engineering oriented. I love it. But it's actually my experience has been the opposite. Only in the last 3 months as I paid attention to it, that actually tears, make you feel better, which again, elementary stuff, but for me, pretty revolutionary.
Yeah. Well, yep, absolutely. Right. Oh, wow. I was like, I'm starting to like take some notes, like curtain of disillusionment. Was kind of like my note to self. But if yours was a layer of glass, um, I would share, I'll use your analogy. That glass could be clear, frosted, um, slightly tinted, or like really dark and opaque. I mean, that's what. Um,
Maybe it's the window, and sometimes the curtains just get closed over the window. That tie the two
yeah,
together, right?
yeah. I mean, for me, it felt like there was just black smoke outside that window. There was no point in looking through it. That's what it feels. That's what it felt like for those first couple months of having what one of the books on our shelf says. It's called Parenthood Lost. Like, we were totally pumped to be parents. It took a while to get pregnant. And then we monitored this pregnancy and built out the baby's room, and then boom, we were just empty. Um, it felt like your layer of glass. So on the other side of that glass, or in between the glass, was like pretty black smoke. I could not envision much in the future for some time there. It was day to day survival, literally 1 hour at a time for months.
And that's the hopelessness. That is a bullet point under depression,
Yes,
right?
hopelessness. Yep. Right, because you're almost at that point in time, you're almost so numb that like I can't. I don't really have the energy to be sad. I certainly don't have the energy to be angry at times. I don't really even have the energy to be frustrated. I am just numb, stuck in disbelief, stuck behind a heavily frosted glass or smoky glass. Yeah, very myopic, very myopic.
I'm glad you mentioned the name of the book on your shelf, Parenthood Lost. I'll also drop a link for that. And then the one I read is called Orphaned Adult, about losing a parent.
Oh wow, yeah, at the other end of the life spectrum, right? Yeah, is like here we are. Well, I'll admit my age by putting myself in this bucket, right? Saying the sandwich generation. That my parents are in their mid 80s now, right? So just biologically, regardless of disease and accidents and tragedies, I risk losing them. And yet I'm also still sort of raising young adults. That's the sandwich they talk about. So yeah, you and I've experienced grief on either end.
And what's interesting is that the experience is very similar regardless of what it is, loss, grief, or as we'll get to, ERP implementations.
Yeah. Let's see. Um, so we've talked a little bit about anger, shame. I felt like I kind of owed you and the audience like a little bit about shame playing a role. And I'm kind of happy to use the personal story I've shared. When the doctor delivered the news to my wife and I that our baby had passed, they couldn't find a heartbeat. Um, and this was only 2 or 3 days after we just had like a healthy check-in and like, hey, should we be inducing? Like, no, let's let the baby's lungs develop. Let's let Ava's lungs develop a little bit more. And the best place for her is with her mother while she's developing, and then we'll induce if we have to in the next week or so. When the doctor told us, like, yeah, she's dead. Um, disbelief hit mixed with anger, and some of the anger was like literally at the mechanics of um, the um, the baby, right? Like, how could you abandon us? We have gotten like I have like painted your room for you. It's all pink and ready for you, and your mother is just so counting on you coming. So part of the grieving process, like right at the initial stages of like losing a child, was like this little slice of anger at the child. I was totally pissed at the doctor, totally pissed at the hospital system, totally pissed at shitty luck. Sorry, pardon my French.
Were you mad at yourself for not inducing?
Yes, absolutely. Yep. So self doubt, what ifs, second guessing, and then the slice of anger directed towards the infant who just died, like immediately triggered shame. So that's one of the reasons why I kind of put down that, like, well, what does shame have to do with grief? It can be part of the process. And so coming to acceptance that, like, ooh, that shame aspect, the anger aspect, those are parts of the grieving process. But at the time, it was very confusing.
I'll piggyback on your shame. For me, what came before that is selfishness. Like I have never seen how selfish I am until the last 7 years. And I was thankful to read it in the book I read, that it's common. You petty, selfish, like you're just disgusted with yourself. And so there's a shame that then comes along with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So to be totally honest, and I've shared this with my wife and multiple therapists since, but now I get to share with this audience because that was a great prompt. Some of the shame was from like selfish thoughts, like, oh, people are going to pity me. Uh, and like, I wasn't even thinking about my wife and I as as a married couple who had just lost our child and parenthood in general. The first place I went to for a few seconds there was like, oh, me, I will now be carrying in the object of pity. And dang it, I don't want to be an object of pity. That is so unappealing. Yeah. And then of course, then that would flush away, and you're like, I'm not going to be a parent. Oh my gosh! So now it's into the loss, and sadness. But those cycles, as your brain processes those, the little shame part of the selfishness, that kind of kept like a little bouncing ball would come back. It was most dramatic in those first like 1 minute or so. But it's amazing that in a life of what 53 and a half years thus far, that 1 or 2 seconds of processing and thinking selfishly, it still sticks with me. It's just burned into my brain from 22 years ago. It only lasted a few seconds.
Your bouncing ball analogy made me think that now might be a good time to pick on Kubler-Ross and the beautiful structure of it. What do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, um, uh, in our project management sessions that Tim had kind of referenced at the beginning, the Kubler-Ross, and I think you might have put it in a link associated with the Kubler-Ross
I
curve.
did.
Yeah, this is a researcher who literally called it the Kubler-Ross grief curve, that basically plots at first fairly elevated expectations about um, what a given process will look like, and then the curve descends into like a belly that kind of goes down low. Some label that the trough of disillusionment, and it gets it gets invoked for like that's the dark part of grief, right? Um, that's numbness,
Actually, the bullet point on one of the images I'll put on this episode in that trough, it actually labels it depression.
depression, right? Exactly. Yeah. So that's depression. Now the sadness, the anger, the shame, the numbness, the frustration, the loss of control, they are all contributing to depression, and that would be very normal. And some rotating ball or Rubik's cube of those mixed emotions really kind of contributing to depression. Yeah. And then coming out of that low point and beginning to climb in the grief curve is really called growing acceptance, learning to live with the grieving process, that anger will be there, shame may reside, sadness might be lifelong, frustration, um, uh, periods of disbelief, those will all remain, but they begin to diminish, and acceptance starts to ideally win over those, and the curve starts to climb out of depression. Learning to live with grief. The hard part, the reason why Tim and I, at least one reason why I think Tim and I wanted to pick on that curve, is because it has a start and an end. It's a plot, and it doesn't reflect very well what the journey looks like if it spans from 2015 to present, or in my case, from 2001 to present, for just one event worth grieving. Like, I keep kind of going back sometimes through that trough in like little bits and pieces. How else would you reference Kubler-Ross and its shortcomings?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And then I would also pick on it in that it gives you the impression that you can put yourself somewhere on that plot. Like, oh, okay, I must be only experiencing this now. Whereas it's really, at least in my experience, a big jumble. It's like three-dimensional and it's all coming at once. And another thing I don't like about it is it makes it, like you said, the start and the end. It makes it look like you're going through something. And actually, in the orphan adult book I read, I like how he described it because he is both a professional therapist and talked about the experience of losing his own parents at different times. So he kind of wove the personal and the professional together. And he said in his experience and talking with his patients about it as well, it's not that you get through grief, it's that grief gets through you. So it's
Oh,
not
that's
that you're
good.
kind of traveling through this nice, colorful Kubler-Ross curve. It's like bouncing around you. It's exploding inside you. It's you don't even, it's there's a physical component to it, and it's all kind of happening at once. It's just this big jumble.
All at once. That's really important. Um, so it's almost like the Kubler-Ross grief curve does a poor job for describing humans, and it was almost designed for project implementation instead. It should really just be relabeled the Kubler-Ross like software implementation curve because the grief part is so much messier.
Yeah, and actually the image I had on the last episode, it's actually called the Kubler-Ross change curve, which I think is an interesting connection between just change in general and grief. And then also in the that orphaned adult book I read, he says that it was originally Kubler-Ross came up with it to describe the experience of someone who is dying, not the experience of someone who's grieving the loss of someone else. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. So we can pick on them without, you know, hurting their feelings because they maybe didn't intend it to be used for what it's used for.
Fair enough. You're right. That maybe the grief curve. And so another part of like if you use that plot for an implementation project, it's actually a little more applicable because if I'm at this point and I want to get to that next point, I can actually throw more resources at the project, right? I can literally pull myself along. And that's not how grief works. You can't say, well, I'm down in depression, so I just need to mechanically pull myself along and start working on acceptance. Acceptance will come to you, or say, so you don't pass through grief. Grief passes through you. Is that how you said it?
Yeah, that matched my experience. That was from that book I read. Yeah.
Yep. That's a great label. So um, the grief, if there is a grief curve, it's not a line. It's not a line. It's um, it's something maybe that you can't actually put on in two dimensions because it has to pass through you.
It's like a pill you swallow that chemically has an effect on you in ways that you don't even understand, but you can sure feel it,
And it's
right?
gonna, and mine's still reverberating, 22 years later. Yeah.
Yeah, and your point on acceptance was insightful for me. I hadn't heard this yet, that you listed acceptance as a feeling. So on our bullet points, we had anger, shame, sadness, disbelief, numbness, frustration, loss of control. You also added acceptance. And I'm like, huh? That should be like the next point in the outline, not the bullet point under feelings. And uh, it actually made a lot more sense that it's almost kind of part of the process and almost something that you never fully arrive at. Is that how you would describe it?
A journey, yes. That acceptance, just like anger, comes in waves, and sometimes they're more or less intense. And they, for me, over the course of 22 years, it's been additive. I had this much acceptance at one point in time, and I have a little bit more acceptance a little bit later. Um, and one of the reasons why acceptance is the feeling, resignation's not a fair word. Like, how can I resign myself to have lost my daughter? I simply have to kind of accept that I lost her, and that we and doctors and biology did everything they could to have it turn out differently, but it didn't. Um, and so acceptance just kind of grows a little bit stronger with the passage of time and processing the grief. It doesn't mean that there aren't flares of anger, little flares of shame, definitely flares of sadness. Um, Acceptance.
And as you're describing it, it almost sounds like acceptance is not the presence of something that you set your mind to get to acceptance. It's more the absence of something that you processed all of the other things and let that run through you. And then once it
Right.
did, then it's the absence of those things that kind of brings you to acceptance.
Right. What is left in the void, having experienced anger, experienced frustration, recognized shame, acknowledged sadness, cried those tears. What is left, the gift that is left, is acceptance. It's almost like this much appreciated residual of having gone through that. What's replacing it? Elation? No. But acceptance allows you to actually move on, right? Have your layers of glass grow less opaque, actually be able to envision a future, have hope start to return. Acceptance allows hope to kind of seep back in for the future. Yeah.
So if it's okay, I think I'm going to move to the lesson learned part on our
Yes.
outline and add one to the top related to acceptance that we did not have on our outline. Tell me what you think of this. Um, Acceptance is not the presence of something, but the absence of something.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
And maybe for this one, because I ad-libbed it, I will apply it immediately to an ERP implementation. I think for the other ones, we wanted to go through them first and then come back and apply them. Or maybe we apply them one by one. We can see.
Yeah, we could do that either way.
It feels a lot to me like a go live. I mean, so many times you see a go live and it's like, okay, we're live, like, are we live? Right. And it's not like this switch that you flip that you're kind of imagining, ding, okay, we're live. And it's almost like a question mark. We're live, like, okay, we were able
Right.
to ship out inventory today, but we haven't closed the month. And so it's not that it's really the presence of something, it's that it's the absence of all the things on our pre-go live checklist. We got through them, so we're going to call ourselves live now, even though it doesn't feel like it.
Right. Or UAT was acceptable enough. And you know what? The day is upon us. We are now live. Kind of whether we like it or not. Yeah, it definitely has an acceptance tie. Absolutely. Cool. All right. Well, I'm gonna chime in with my favorite lessons learned and do a little bit of tying to my professional life because that was one of the most motivational things about this topic. Resiliency. We haven't really talked about this. We've talked about the process of anger, shame, sadness, acceptance, disbelief, frustration. But one of the outcomes for me was my personal grieving process yielding something called resiliency. It's played a role in my personal life in that being married for 25 plus years is always going to have challenges. Child rearing, economics, jobs, parents, physically where you live, etc. And my wife and I have leaned on the resiliency that we gained from losing Ava to say, we survived that. This challenge before us, paying a credit card bill, the car dying, having to um, jump through flaming hoops to adopt children from South Korea. Like, those are trivial. Like, our marriage survived losing our baby. So I trust. Resiliency gives me trust that we will survive this too. And so it's like almost optimism. And it's been so powerful that it plays a role in my daily work as a software professional. That when we're approaching a go live and everybody's stress levels are high and the KPIs aren't trending exactly the way we want and people maybe even threatening legal action. I have like resiliency personally to kind of put those professional challenges in perspective and say, you know what? At the end of today, we might have lost a couple $100,000 on the e-commerce portal because it didn't go live when it should have. But we're all going to sleep in our own bed. No one's invading our country. No one's going to lose a limb or have their lungs malfunction tonight or tomorrow. This is an ERP implementation. We will survive this. And so losing Ava has actually granted me this resiliency gift of perspective that continues to pay dividends. So I do thank her for
You
it.
said yesterday in our little prep session that we did,
Yeah.
you mentioned that there's stats on uh, marriages that end in divorce following the loss of a child. And I just did a quick Google. I don't know if this is right, but the one I found says 80%.
Gosh, it is. I think it's been a long time since I've looked at it, but it was like astronomical. And that was a frightening statistic to read. Yeah, to read a few months after we lost Ava. And my wife and I looking at each other like, can you imagine abandoning one another right now? Like statistically, you're right. 80% of the time this marriage should fail. But can you imagine doing that to the other person? To leave them alone with this? Who else in the world knows what this awful event feels like, really? Because at the time, actually, our families were really failing to provide much solace because they had no idea. Like, unless you've lost a child, we had one uncle who had lost a child who was capable of saying words that actually resonated with us. Everyone else was kind of noise at the time. So I couldn't imagine leaving Aaron alone with that. Anyways, yeah, it's a scary statistic that losing a child causes very high divorce rates potentially.
So you got through it, and a lesson learned is resiliency.
Resiliency is an outcome. Oh, we talked a little bit about resiliency, I think, too. That um, how does surviving one implementation as a professional who does this for a living or a customer build resiliency? Having gone through one implementation, you'll be better prepared for the next. So resiliency does happen um, in our professional lives too.
Yeah, and just for change in general, like the title of that image that I'll link to is actually the change curve, and it builds resiliency for changing jobs, changing, roles, change. I don't like it. You said you like change. I don't. Different personality types, but it's just something that is, and you can. To me, it's good news that you can build resiliency and be better prepared. That it's not a genetic thing where some people do like it better than others. That no matter what your personality type is, you can build resiliency.
Yep, absolutely. Um, can you tell us, Tim, like how would you reflect on one of our key lessons learned? That grieving is a learned skill.
So this one I actually picked up from a group that I just started attending. It's a weekly meeting. I kind of describe it like Alcoholics Anonymous, but for grief. You can see it at, I'll link to it, griefshare.org. It is a Christian organization, so just be aware of that. And I picked that up from a video. So you kind of gather together, you talk about last week, then you watch a video together, you talk about that, and then just, whatever you want to talk about. And I'll actually link two things together. One is it's a learned skill, which I picked up from that group. And then the other one is that you cannot grieve alone, which was something that a therapist had told me and is the reason why I started going to this group. I'm like, really? I Another one of these like elementary things, that, oh, I didn't know that. So simple solution, right? Okay, go find other people who are grieving. And actually, I had an experience right before the fall before my dad died, 2019. My dad actually ended up dying of COVID in April of 2020. So then I couldn't even be there. I basically heard him suffocating to death on the phone, drove out for the funeral because didn't want to get on the flight. But the fall before, we go out to New York to be with some family on Thanksgiving. Stopped off along the Pennsylvania Turnpike to get some food. And the guy behind the counter, just like for some reason, like there was no glass, like everything else, there's glass. There's no glass between me and this guy for some reason. And he's just like the most real, gentle, like, we're at a fast food place along the turnpike. I felt like he was a butler serving me in a palace or something. And so he goes to get the food and he's like, he can barely walk. I'm pretty sure he had ALS.
Oh, wow.
And I was just like, whoa. And I was just blown away by how helpful it was to be with someone like that. It's just someone else who had a difficult thing going on. And it also made me feel like I don't have a difficult thing going on at all. This guy's still working, he probably has to afford his insurance or whatever it is, right? And yet the way he treated me was just amazing. So, you can't, it's a learned skill, which is good news that you can get better at ERP implementations, and you can't grieve alone. So also you can't get through an ERP implementation just by being the hero and taking care of everything.
Right. Yeah, I kind of wrote down like you can't fully grieve in a vacuum. Like for me personally, there are quiet times by myself, even today, where I do process some level of grief by just in my own thoughts. A lot of times it happens with exercise, like physical movement is therapeutic, right? It's kind of like a stress relief, and that's sometimes you're stressing yourself intentionally, and then you have relief when you finish a run or a bike ride or something like that, and that process does help with some grieving, but that's only part of the ingredient, right? Like without therapy, without a supportive partner, without friends, without Tim's podcast, can't really fully process grief. You must share, and that translates to no one person accomplishes on either the client or the professional services delivery side an implementation. It is a group effort, absolutely, always.
I like your word fully. Yeah, that's a better way of saying it. Because, yeah, even in the implementation, you've got your own open items list. Everyone has individual stuff they do. But yeah, you can't fully grieve. You can't fully get through an implementation on your own. I like that.
Yep. So one of our lessons learned, just to start to encapsulate things, Tim and I are both advocates of, through kind of a painful learning curve ourselves, seeking professional help, perhaps before you can even envision it being valuable to you, right? And it pertains to ERP.
Which I did not do. But yeah.
Look, hindsight being 2020, there were times when I was definitely, I can kind of self-diagnose. I was clinically depressed. I should have been seeking professional help to help me through that clinical depression. I would have served my family, my customers, myself, my marriage. I was beginning to rear a child at that point in time. I would have served everyone better by kind of addressing the fact that I was clinically depressed and could have used some professional help. Yeah, so maybe sooner than you would normally or would envision value or even want to seek therapy. That is a significant lessons learned from mine and Tim's experience.
And so this one's obvious, right? That's why the statistics on failed ERP implementations when the consultant is not involved are so high, right? And for me, it's on the consulting side, I don't even feel like it's because of the expertise. It's just because of having a second pair of eyes. I'm even on the therapy side, like I'm not just getting therapy from therapists. I feel like I'm getting therapy from family members. I'm looking at it different. Getting therapy from this podcast episode. Like, just reaching out to people with this in mind is therapeutic. And so having a second pair of eyes on things is very helpful.
Yeah, a great tie-in. That's what AOG Forums is about. It is therapy for customers and professionals alike to validate what they're doing and not be operating in a vacuum. It definitely serves that role. Like I've done that multiple times where I'm like, I think I would solve it this way, and then I'm like, oh, I just got confirmation from AUG forums that that's how I should do it. Sweet.
And even if you don't, even if there's no answer, there's something comforting knowing that you're not the only one who's frustrated, with
Right.
an unsolvable problem.
Right. Ask the question. Yep. Ask the question, and that just the process of asking is both therapeutic and valuable. Yep.
Now, you said something, I know you might need to go to another call here at the top of the hour, but you said something that I'll add another lesson learned on here. This maybe is the biggest one for me, and I am still in the middle of really understanding this, that grieving is not only can you not fully grieve on your own, your grief affects those around you. And the point is, you're not going through it alone. Everyone around you is going through it too. That is probably the biggest thing that therapy has kicked up for me, the biggest realization. Um, I'm not the only one who has struggled through this. My wife has, my kids have, and that's been quite eye-opening, and I still don't fully see it. I still like I'm feel like I'm still getting the puzzle pieces. Forget putting the puzzle back together again. I'm still finding all the pieces, and that's been a big one, maybe the biggest one. And if you want to apply that to ERP, you're not the only one in your organization who's going through this. Everyone's stressed out, you know, everyone's feeling similar feelings about it. And that's why I think lunch and learns and I don't know, just little venues to kind of express your frustrations as a group instead of just being alone in your cubicle might be a helpful way. You might not even solve stuff, but just a helpful way for you to get through it together as an organization.
Yep. Yeah. I would do a quick plug for like just the therapeutic value of being around other professionals. In this day and age, more of us are working remotely, and our spouses and friends may not be in the same industry, so they they should. Certainly, my wife quickly bores with me sharing stories, but being around other professionals, either at conferences or on site for a customer, um, and having connection with colleagues is definitely therapeutic too. So sometimes it's not really solving anything; it's just being able to vent, which is a big part of the grieving process. Is just to share the fact that you're angry or frustrated or sad or even ashamed. That there's value in both the personal life and we were just at a conference a week or so ago, and I'm actually kind of surprised at the therapeutic nature of just being around other professionals and being able to share stories, even if we're not actually helping one another's physical projects move along. Just the community, it's really valuable.
As you say that, I'm realizing that, in the pandemic, frontline workers, nurses, etc., bore bore the brunt of the physical brutality of that, right? So I am not saying that we had it worse at all, but I am saying because we didn't. But I am saying that on the back end of the pandemic, that is something that I've been realizing more and more. As back office accounting workers, whether you're a consultant or someone in your organization, you got you got to work home, which was awesome in the pandemic, right? You're like, I still get to work a job. Not everyone gets to do this, right? I don't have to worry about getting the virus. But on the back end of the pandemic, there's actually an impact there that is not that easy to recognize. And the social isolation actually it does some damage too. I'm not saying to the same degree as being on the front line, but it's not insignificant, right? And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. The importance of gathering even professionally with other people is huge.
Yeah, yeah. And my wife is a frontline worker, right? She's an oncology nurse, and her oncology floor was compromised by COVID, right? That they they're trained in oncology features of fighting cancer, and yet what they had to really do is basically staff a COVID reaction floor. So that was hard for them to like not have their primary skill set leveraged, but and they faced way more physical danger than someone involved in software implementation. Absolutely, they were truly on the front line, but at least they were shoulder to shoulder, and
That's my point. That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. So they offsetting the much more significant risk during the pandemic, the community that they had, and going out drinking with a bunch of oncology nurses is way rowdier than the fraternity ever was back in the day. I mean, they see the gruesome end of life, and their humor can be dark if you are not initiated or not inebriated or both. Yeah. So anyway, they have their to your point, they have their community and their outlet to help a little bit to help offset their risk. Whereas in the software world, where we sit quietly in our basement with our hoodies on, there are times when we are not doing ourselves a service. And I'll admit, like that, even my own social skill set with like friends in the neighborhood, buddies who I mountain bike with, and such. Some of my social skills took a little dip during the COVID, and I'm still kind of recovering from it, from that the natural inclination to like, I'll just go for a bike ride by myself. No, come on, remember, you love going out with these guys and riding, and then having a beer afterwards. You're you're all collectively worth it. Do it. So, not sure how it ties into ERP implementation, but maybe you can bring us back.
Well, I feel like we started with grief. Maybe we end with grief. I don't know. It's definitely related. There's definitely a connection. I think whether anyone else listens to this episode or not, I still think it's there's a relationship between the two.
Yeah.
When
Mhm.
you were talking just now, it reminded me of so I watched in the last few months this documentary called 11 Minutes. It's on
Yes.
Paramount Plus. It's about the 11 minutes of gunfire at the largest mass shooting in U.S. history in Las Vegas at that country concert.
Wow.
And I wrote this down because the whole thing was stood out to me. But this one particular guy was an off-duty firefighter, ends up jumping in and saving someone's life.
Mm-hmm.
And you think this guy's a firefighter; he sees stuff all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I wrote down his quote in my journal. I journal now. I'll read it to you. This guy like totally put together. I mean, he's fit. You know, he looks totally put together. And this is what he says. So if you don't talk about the stuff, and if you don't get the stuff out of you, it's toxic. My life got leveled over the last few years. Marriage went away. Everything has been leveled in my life. I didn't know if there was going to be a way out for me, but ironically, I had to lose everything. I basically had to let go of the old Dean and embrace the new Dean.
Hmm.
Might be too dramatic for ERP implementations. For sure, with grief, grief can do that. And if you want to apply it to ERP, um, you don't need to quit your job. You don't need to storm out and cuss someone out and get fired because you're so frustrated. Talk about it. Realize you're not alone in it, and don't let the toxic stuff build up inside of you.
Yep. I like that. I think that's a good place. I think that's a good place you brought us to. Um, I did not have a hard stop, but I feel like we've reached a good spot with your quote on the firefighter, someone who actually went in there, and what were some of the impacts of the grieving and post traumatic stress syndrome that person might have experienced, and then making it to the other side, almost kind of reconstructed.
Yeah, almost a build from scratch. Yeah, yeah. Hey Tom, thanks for participating with me in this crazy idea. Hopefully others get something out of it. We were able to talk about our feelings in a uh, I think in a pretty professional way. But, I'll just say that as much as I'm laughing and talking normally, the experience of this was anything but. I had never experienced sobbing like a wounded animal, like I had, et cetera, et cetera. So, as cold and professional as this might sound, I think for both of us, we could admit they're not just bullet points. These are
No.
crushing things that we all go through at different times in our lives.
Right. Well, but here's part of it. I shed a tear or two when your first email came over and said, "Hey, Tom, what do you think about this topic?" Right. So I shed a tear there. I shed a tear or two sharing our um, planning session yesterday, and letting my wife know that I was going to be talking about some kind of personal things. So what happened today? You and I had maybe done some processing ahead of time, and we're able to kind of talk about it from like a place of a bit more acceptance and calmness, because some processing happened, just to bring us to this podcast, and there might be processing afterwards too. That's one of the reasons why, like, I was able to talk about some extremely personal things today and not get broken up, because I've already done some of the work, quite a bit of work actually. Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's really cool to hear. And I echo your experience. Yeah. Wow. That's cool.
Sweet. No, you are you're a brave you are a brave introvert who's really actually an extrovert. Um, and I want to thank you for inviting me to kind of talk about grief and loss and some of its ties to software implementation. Thank you.
Well, right back at you. And I hope that others benefit from it.
Thanks, Tim.
Hey, I'm recording this afterwards and I'm tacking it on to the end of this episode to mention one more lesson learned. After Tom and I ended our call, I got up from my desk for a short break, as I usually do after a call. I quickly noticed that my neck muscles were tense and I was breathing more heavily than usual. I've learned that when grief sneaks up on you, you can sometimes recognize it with physical signs. Everyone has different physical signs, and I've learned a little about what mine are. So rather than go back to my desk, I went for a walk. I then found a place to sit. It took a little while, but I eventually realized that I was reliving a memory. My dad passed away in early April 2020 from COVID. He was the 64th person in the county of San Diego to die from COVID, and his memory care facility was one of the hardest hit in the state of California. We think that about 25% of the people in my dad's memory care facility died from COVID. I am full of gratitude to the staff there, many of whom I got to know personally, who continued to care for my dad and others in the midst of so much death. After my dad died, I drove across the country from Ohio to California to attend a simple memorial time. We parked about 8 cars in a circle at the cemetery with close family and friends. Then we got on a Zoom call and took turns sharing stories about my dad. After that, a few of us carried the casket to the gravesite with masks on, and we had a simple time there, respecting the state of California's ordinance to have 10 people or less at the gravesite. My dad would have liked that because he was very much a rule follower, and so am I. Then we got in our cars and went home, unable to have a meal together. You see, in my family, it was a tradition to go out to an Italian restaurant and have a big family meal after a funeral. I had been really looking forward to doing that, but we weren't able to. So, as I was sitting there after this podcast recording, I realized that I was reliving that painful memory of not having a meal together. It took a little while, but eventually the tears came, which was a release. My neck muscles relaxed, my breathing calmed down, and I felt much better. What's the lesson learned? I got this one from a therapist, and here it is. Lean into the grief. Don't run from it. It took me a couple of years to start practicing that, but it's been very helpful. So, if you're in the middle of an Acumatica implementation right now, and maybe you're sitting at your desk working on something, then suddenly some strong feelings come. Maybe you feel overwhelmed at having to do your regular job in addition to a bunch of stuff for the implementation. Maybe you're frustrated with a coworker because of office politics, which often become more intense during implementations. Maybe you're missing your legacy ERP product, which might sound silly, but I've seen it happen many times. If those kinds of strong feelings come, lean into them. Maybe take a break and go for a walk. Maybe go tell a coworker who you trust about how you're feeling. Don't run from the feelings. Lean into them. If you're a consultant, just charge your time to an overhead code and call it building resilience. And know that grief feelings don't last forever. A therapist taught me that feelings only last for less than 1 to 10 minutes. Sorry, less than 1 to 2 minutes, which isn't so bad in the grand scheme of things. We all go through grief, but grief is not our identity. Grief is just something that we all experience temporarily at different times in our lives and for different reasons. So, if you're in the middle of an Acumatica implementation right now, hang in there. You'll get through it, and you'll emerge from the experience a more resilient person. All right, well, that's it for now. We'll catch you on the next episode of AUGforums.com Real Talk. Thanks for listening, and take care.